Greetings to everyone. I am Akin Odebunmi from the University of Ibadan. I'm speaking to the presentation entitled Cognition Pragmatics, a Theory of Second Language Communication. And on the screen, I have two personalities who have a lot of influence on this presentation. First was the inaugural lecture given by Professor Akin of the University of Ibadan. And second was the support I received from Professor Jacob May while trying to develop the preliminary version of the theory of cognition pragmatics. And going forward, after this presentation, I'll be working with Edgar Stroider and Jane Odo, both of Kenya, to develop the theory fully with input from East Africa in terms of data and theorization. So first, a scenario which I'm going to still speak to after this at the end of the presentation, when I try to see how the principles are applied to data. Here we have two personalities. We have Adeniji, we have Clay, and the word Aristo is used by Adeniji. What does Aristo mean? How does Adeniji conceive of Aristo? How does Clay access the word Aristo? Eventually, what is the context of the use of Aristo, which is not strictly an English language word? So in this presentation, I'll be talking about the motivation for the theory of cognition pragmatics, the goals, the lacuna, the conceptual clarifications, the principles of the theory. Then I'm going to conclude the presentation. So what's the motivation for the theory? There is the expression from the Bible, John 14:2, in my father's house, there are many mansions. The statement was adopted by Professor Akin in his inaugural lecture of February 25, 2016, as my father's house, there are many languages. That was in the context of multilingualism and sociolinguistics. In developing the theory of cognition pragmatics, I have two adaptations of the same biblical expression. First is, in my father's house, there are many languages of equal standing. The second is, in my father's house, there are many varieties of a language of equal standing, with speakers demonstrating shared mental lexicon of L2 and L1. But briefly, I say that the concept of the family conceptualized or illustrated by the family metaphor could take us to the biological children in a family and the adopted children if there are. And then in the biological children side, we have the endoecology, which is like the native English. And then we have the exoecology, which is the L2 English. It could be L1 German, L2 German, it could be L1 Portuguese, it could be L2 Portuguese. And of course, because of the fact that speakers in the endoecology grew up in the same environment, they have related exposures and they have related experiences. The same applies to the people or speakers of L2 in the same environment in the exoecology. Exposures are the same, experiences are the same as well. And that's what I've tried to do. Now, a few illustrations in terms of the words that I used in the different environments before I go to talking about the principles. We have three words here. We have introduction, we have bush, we have wife. When you speak English as a native language, you know what introduction means. You know what bush means, although if you speak the Australian English, the native English in Australia, bush will be the same as what we see bush to be in Africa. Wife will be the same as what the American speaker or the British speaker will see wife to be. But for us in Nigeria, particularly, I'm using the Nigerian examples, introduction would also be the normal introduction that you have, but it could also be a ceremony that is held between the families of prospective brides and grooms before the actual wedding ceremony. Ambush could be marijuana, while wife could be a woman that is married to all the men in her husband's family. And so the point is this: we have seen the literature in the second language context where the correct and the incorrect forms have been described. For example, it's very common to say that, okay, when you have introduction, it is introduction of someone and not introduction of a wedding. You know, these are, and so you want to correct the speaker as right, as wrong, and so you want to bring in the right form. Well, this is one major way the variety has been studied. But it's discovered that you have more people speaking the non-native variety than the native ones, which means that it's necessary for us to understand the dynamics and the context and the pragmatics of this non-native variety in terms of what informs the choices, how do the speakers get to access them, and of course, this in terms of what do they have in their brains. How does the content, the lexical content in the brain of a speaker in the L2 context connect with the lexical content of the same another speaker in the L2 context? At several levels of context here, you talk about the social, you talk about the cultural, talk about the ideological. And all of these are not already described in the literature. And that means that it's very difficult to fully understand why or how people use language beyond looking at the correct and the incorrect forms. And then it's also interesting to see how the complex mental processing that stocks L1 and L2 eventually assigns shared pragmatic meanings to words from a pool of two varieties. In the L2 setting, you have people who speak English. The English words are the same all over the world, but the meanings in the second language context are different, and they have their context and they have every other thing that gives them what they stand for. Precisely, this is what COSP is trying to describe. Now, for data, I take samples and text from Nigeria, the media, daily encounters, literary texts, and then that's what I use to preliminarily develop the model. But going forward, there will be more organized data collected, both in Nigeria and Kenya. Some terminologies have been developed as far as possible, but there will be more. And then there are adoptions and adaptations of terminologies already existing in the literature. Further fine-tuning of these, and then some of them may be dropped for some of the distinctive concept of the theory as we move on. Now, some of the concepts here, what are the distinctions? Are they, how do we talk about the theory itself in terms of what it is and what it stands for? And one of the conceptualizations in the theory, one of the things that we take for granted is that L2, or one of the pillars on which the theory stands, is that L2 is submerged in intercultural context. And that means that, well, when you have English, for example, in the second language context, you are talking about two cultures. You talk about the culture of L1, talk about the culture of L2, but the meaning you have eventually becomes a mix. At the same time, there's a complex outcome that eventually gives you the peculiarity of the second language, which the first language speaker will not relate to unless there is accommodation or there is negotiation. So that's one assumption of the theory. And another thing to look at is the related models. What models are related to cognition pragmatics? First, I talk about the cognitive philosophical models, and that's where you talk about interactant intentions, which have to be mutually recoverable by the parties, by the interactive parties for them to communicate effectively. The cognition pragmatics is saying that communicative content, which are words and their concepts and conceptualizations, particularly in the L2 settings, have to be mutually represented in interactive parties' joint memories and mental stores for effective communication. On this basis, at least tentatively speaking, we could say that COSP is differentiated from a number of existing paradigms: variation pragmatics, post-colonial pragmatics, intentional theories, intercultural or cross-cultural pragmatics. Basically, all right, there are ways, there are areas they converge, there are areas they diverge, there are areas they have the same interests. So all of these will be straight out in the full development of the theory. And then we can also minimally talk about the distinction between cognitive pragmatics and cognition pragmatics, where cognition pragmatics will be the product, the state of mind of the speakers, while the cognitive pragmatics will be the process, the social aspects of language use and acquisition. I give credit to Professor Jacob May for the distinction between cognition and cognitive pragmatics. And I really appreciate what he did to ensure that the theory preliminarily had a shape that I could present to this important audience. Now we have some principles of the theory. Very briefly, I'll talk about them. Then I finalize by applying them to the interaction I shared earlier. Shared cognitions, the embedding frame of COSP, then the constituent and the operations. So I'll talk about them very briefly, one after the other. When it comes to shared cognitions, you are talking about a society where you have the ideal individual, then you have the concrete individual. The ideal has everything, right? Where you have all of this mixed, either mixed in terms of the several direct parentages, or all of these parentages combined with the adoptive language cognition. Unfortunately, there's no time to develop all of this. So these are the things I've just mentioned. Then I come to the communicative cues, where we have two pull factors: the factors that inform communicative action, the family origin pool, and then the adoption origin pool. When it's the family origin pool, the choice force, it comes from the common origin. And so you are considering, for example, native English while you talk. So the choices will be strictly from native English. And that's where bribe is the same, take is the same, boy is the same, man is the same in all varieties. So you use that. But when it comes to the adoption pool, we have two glides or clines. The first is the indigenized cline, where the adoption or adoptee origin glides towards the family origin. For example, you have Fanimoros, which is Fani, which is Yoruba, and then you combine that with the suffix oros, all right, which will give us the adjectival form of Fanimora, Fanimoros, okay? Then you have Buka Teria. Buka is Hausa, but area or teria is the French suffix, which is already adopted in English, borrowed into the English language. And so this is where you have the adoptive origin gliding towards the family origin, as we have it. And then the localized glide or cline is where the family origin glides towards local stimuli and pressure. And here you have certain manifestations such as the conceptualization or contextual localization. For example, you have Aristo, which I'm going to talk about later on, which is a conceptualized item. You have body ring, which means the big male organ, which is contextually localized, and so forth. Manchester, for example, means a noticeably big female breast, and you know what Manchester is in the native context. So in this case, it's contextually localized. These are informed by certain factors, and they are all present in the cognition of the to speaker of English Nigeria. Then we have the context resources, which are three, but two of them are illustrated in this presentation because I found examples only for two of them: the contextualization and intertextualization. Then when I'm talking about the examples here, you have the slides, so you could look at the examples. Otherwise, I would spend 1 hour talking about all of this. Then the knowledge resources. for pragmatic access will be three: the conventional knowledge, cultural knowledge, and then social knowledge, where cultural knowledge is only the knowledge of the culture, and the social knowledge is the knowledge of the society, not of culture. We're going to see that in the analysis I'm going to provide. And then I've given examples of when it's conventional, the same as in native English. But when it is cultural, it's different. A wife, for example, is not the same as a wife in the US or in the UK. So they are not the same. And when it comes to the social knowledge, you have to be a member of that society to know what those words mean. Sugar mommy, for example, is not the mommy that sells sugar, or not the moment that's associated with sugar. It's a different thing entirely. You are talking about market here. Market here is not a place. It's actually a factor. And so all of these are things that we look at, the examples that provide the resources for CSP. Then the interactivity resources will be where all of the factors, all of the features mentioned up to 7.4 converge at the level of interactivity to give us the pragmatic interpretations. And that's where we now start to talk about the assumptions, for example, where we say that interactivity resources rely on four assumptions. I mentioned this when I was talking about the embedded frame of CSP: experience, cultural insideness, cultural outsideness, and then geographical outsideness being in the same environment. Okay, then the assumptions will now determine what the parties pick out from word choices. And this will be the reference, the actual mental images, and then the references, the referring expressions that will pick out persons, object history, and processes. And then the cognitive encounters that are initiated by the choices would be related to what you have in the mental lexicon itself, what's there readily, what's there partially, what's not even there at all. And then interactivity resources will now go into core pragmatic things such as how do you account for intention? Do you want your intention recovered, or do you not want the intention recovered? And that's where cognition pragmatics differs essentially from the cognitive philosophical model, where intentions must always be recovered at all times. Okay? And then you are talking about providing clues, or of course, sometimes even bringing in misunderstanding, depending on precisely the goal of the interaction. And so you need a high measure of pragmatic control of the adoptee ecology and commonality to interpret what you know as English words ordinarily. So it means that your knowledge of English words will not be sufficient when you come to the second language context of English. Also, you have to relearn the English for you to understand what people are saying in Nigeria, for example. And it's the same words of English that you're going to encounter. So it's not about one being inferior or about one being superior, but it's about in what context are the words used. So quickly, I look at the example here, and I say more emphatically here that we have two characters here. This is a real life event, but the names are pseudonyms. Adeniji, 25-year-old assistant to Clay. Clay is an American, 63 years old. Clay has been living in Nigeria for 5 years. But the story is that Clay is dating a young woman. And this woman is the girlfriend of Adeniji's friend. And so for Adeniji, that is not correct. For Clay, there's no problem with it. That is the long and short of the interaction. And that's why, because Clay is an older man dating a very young woman, he qualifies or is described as an aristo. And that's precisely what it is. But who is an aristo? What are the context of the concept of aristo? We see that in the analysis. So I go to the analytical constituent and then contextual resources. Then I say that the adoptive form that we are looking at here is aristo. The co-tests are there, Aristo versus the Boss, American, Managing Director, and so forth. And then the logical, semantic, and pragmatic extensions of the co-text will be items like my friend is actually disturbed and so forth, all right? The friend is disturbed because the friend doesn't feel that Adeniji's boss should be dating his girlfriend. And it's on that ground that he had to drop the girlfriend and had to find another woman that he eventually married. That's what Adeniji said towards the end of it. So we have two contexts here. The first one is the social context. The second is the cultural context, where the social context will bifurcate into dating and then ethicality. We have the examples here. Well, it's not ethical for you to do that. That's what Adeniji is saying. Then the cultural context will be what can be described as cultural dissonance, where there is no agreement. The culture from which Adeniji is speaking is different from the culture from which Clay is speaking. Then the interactivity and recovery issues will take us to assumptions. And then here we talk about social insideness, not cultural insideness. For Clay, for example, Clay is a part of that society for a while. And so, but Adeniji has been there all his life. So the two of them orient to social insideness, the assumptions, reference, interpretations, and then communication. What do the parties speak out? The reference will illustrate, for example, a disproportion. One is much older than the other one. There's also the socially mobile or influential man, that's Clay, and then the girlfriend. Then there's also the socially disadvantaged gold-digging woman, and that's the girlfriend. That is the social-culturally unacceptable relationship. That's the one between Clay then the girlfriend, as conceived by Adeniji, not as conceived by Clay. The references will be the items that are used to pick this out. The referential implications will be whether or not the relationship pointed at is acceptable. And so here you look at it from two levels or more. You are talking about the hierarchical, endospatial, social or cultural insider perspective. Now you are talking here about Adeniji, who is a member of the culture and who feels that dating is not acceptable. And then you are talking about the speaker's exospatial, socio-cultural outsider perspective, where you are talking about someone who feels that what Clay is doing is not correct, but where Clay is feeling that what he's doing is correct. Then you talk about the cognitive encounters initiated with the choices, what's there in the lexicon, the mental lexicon. Aristotle is there in the mental lexicon, but somewhat not fully in one, although lexically, yes. You talk about Clay using, for example, the family origin pool, using his knowledge of Aristotle or aristocratic. And then, yeah, he knows, because he's a native speaker, he could see that Aristotle looks like the clip of Aristotle or aristocratic, and so he's able to relate to it. But the adoption pool is also there because it's been there for 5 years, and Adeniji uses more of the adoption pool. He knows what Aristotle means, but he doesn't know it just socially, but also culturally. So you are talking about Clay not knowing the cultural implications of what the Aristotle is. And then when it comes to recovery intention, of course, what Adeniji wants is to bring the irresponsible or socially unacceptable action of Clay to his attention. And he does that by saying you are the Aristotle boss. And then Clay recovers that, but does not demonstrate shared orientation to the irresponsibility agenda. For him, he evokes the exospatial cultural outsideness to neutralize the unacceptability or irresponsibility thesis. Clay recognizes the ethical constraint, but he evokes endospatial social insideness. He knows only Adeniji, he doesn't know his friend, and so he doesn't have any constraints there. So then the demand of a high measure of pragmatic control here. Clay has been there for a while, and so he knows some things, but not the culture. But Adeniji knows both the society in terms of the experience and then the culture. And when it now comes to the resources that are used, you talk about the different varieties. And the different varieties also combined with the communicative cues, the pragmatic interpretation resources, and then the knowledge resources that are there. So, for example, Clay as well as Adeniji use the intervariety cognition. The two of them, Clay orients to Aristotle, but also to aristocratic to bring out all of these features that I mentioned earlier on. But most importantly, he uses his concept, his knowledge of intervariety cognition here. And when it comes to his knowledge of that, also the cultural knowledge, to evoke vacancy. The woman is vacant because he doesn't have any constraints. Since the woman is ready for dating, he goes into dating. But you have the influence of the culture on Adeniji. And so while Adeniji also has some knowledge of, well, he might have some knowledge of the conventional meaning of Aristotle because he's educated, yet he also combines that eminently with the social and cultural knowledge of it. And so for him too, a disproportion is there, but there is no occupancy. Date availability, date is available, but it shouldn't be occupied because it comes with stigma because the girlfriend belongs to his friend. And so his boss ordinarily is not expected to occupy that place. And then you have the adoption or localized glide, where you have Aristotle there from Aristotle and aristocratic. It's an innovation. The Aristotle now becomes an innovation. Then there is no assumption that fails because of the social sadness that is shared by the two of them. But then there are cultural issues because Clay doesn't understand the culture precisely as he should because he's a member of the culture. Then we have contextualizations here, where we have three recontextualizations. We have the onomastic recontextualization, where the name Aristotle changes to Aristo. And so it's no longer the name of one person, but a genericized personal label. And then you have the social recontextualization, where Aristotle moves to aristocratic, and then Aristo, where Aristotle used to be or is associated with epistemics, but there is a movement from the epistemics to their morality. Then there is also the class influence from aristocratic, which somehow comes to the same thing as we have in Clay, but then for Adeniji, that's not so. Then we have the cultural contextualization here, where we have aristocratic and Aristotle, and then you have exclusivity and discriminative penchant of the normal aristocratic person to the discriminatory and self-respect. All right. Now you have to be exclusive, but again, you have to be discriminatory, but then you need the social respect, which for Adeniji, that is not available. For Clay, then the conventional versus social knowledge here, we have both Adeniji and Clay understanding the concept of Aristotle, and of course, as dating a younger woman, and Aristotle as a socially influential man or a wealthy man. But for Adeniji, and Aristotle is an older man whose choice of younger woman or younger women should be strictly socially restricted. But for Clay, Aristotle is an older man whose choice of younger women should not be strictly restricted.